Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Luke Collins. I'm an applied linguist by trade, and what I want to present to you today is some of my work looking at news media coverage of the issue of AMR. I focus this question around the notion of agency because I'm particularly interested in the ways in which the news coverage is helping, or otherwise, the public to see itself as an active agent in the issue of AMR and subsequently its solution. So this presentation is based on a paper that came out last year, so I do want to acknowledge my collaborators there, Professors Jaspal and Nerlich. So if this does strike a chord with you, if you're interested in this, you'll find more detail on the methodology and the findings in that paper. And this study covered a period running up to the end of 2015, but this is work that I'll be looking to continue in my role at Lancaster University. So we were interested in this idea of public knowledge and understanding of AMR, partly prompted by findings such as the fact that most people do not feel they have a personal role in either the problem of AMR or its solution. And furthermore, people believe that minimizing antibiotic resistance is outside of their control. They believe that strategies should be aimed at clinicians or just basically anyone else. So we were interested in thinking about, well, where has this idea come from? Knowing that the news media is a source for information for the public in lots of science, health, and technology issues, is this the origin of that point of view? Does it reinforce that point of view? And this is something that was picked up by Fiona Wood in her research brief in 2016, that we should be thinking about this kind of representation. In order to develop effective patient education and health promotion materials to reduce inappropriate antibiotic use, we need to understand how people talk about it and think about it. That is, antibiotics and infection. She even suggests that possible approaches might include a discourse analysis of media reports. And discourse analysis is very much an approach that resides within applied linguistics. Because when we talk about discourses, from my point of view, we're really talking about the accumulation of all the language choices that we all make when we talk about a concept, how we talk it into being. And that certainly chimes with some of the observations that other speakers have made. So discourses, in part, are about information. But for us in applied linguistics, discourses also carry ideologies. So participants draw on linguistic resources to encode combinations of beliefs, values, norms, goals, and emotions. So in the choices that people are making, they're also betraying something of their ideology. It's often very evaluative, or it conveys attitudes about, say, AMR as a gendered issue. And when we think about discourse analysis, one of the approaches that we can take within that set of methodologies is social actor representation, which for the purpose of today's talk, I'm going to orient around these three key questions. So who or what is written about? Quite simply, who's represented in the conversation, who's left out, what terms are used to describe them. And that is simply kind of observed in noun phrases, a good place to start. Who is doing what and to whom? So what are the roles? What are the impacts that certain actors are having on other actors? And again, linguistically, we can quite simply just look at verbal phrases. And then this idea of foregrounding and backgrounding, which I think allows us to pinpoint how certain aspects of the conversation, certain pieces of information are made more prominent and other aspects are marginalized. So just to offer a quick demonstration, this is an example from the data, a very ordinary sentence. In the UK, at least 12,000 people die from antibiotic-resistant bugs each year. With my linguistic hat on, the noun phrase there is at least 12,000 people, so that says to me that the priority there is the number. It objectively sounds like a lot, so it's the muchness that's being prioritized there, and the verbal process is dying. So in essence, a lot of people are dying, which is newsworthy. It's not the first piece of information, though. We do get this prepositional phrase in the UK, so for UK audiences, very quickly establishes why this is of interest to you. It's in this context and it applies to you. So looking at the clause construction then offers us a way to talk about how particular aspects are foregrounded and others are backgrounded. And what I'm arguing is that analysis of processes at the clausal level feed into journalistic practices and broader social discourses. So if you're looking at patterns of this kind of construction, then you can understand what is conventional for a genre of news, and it will also tell you about broader social discourses. But they, in turn, help us make our decisions about how to write the sentence in the first place. So that's quite a precise approach to thinking about language. So how is it that we can do that and also offer any kind of observation about news coverage more broadly? Well, one of the approaches that we can take is we can combine discourse analysis with corpus linguistics. Corpus linguistics refers to a different set of linguistic methodologies that incorporate computational software and tools to help us process large amounts of data, basically, to help us look for those patterns. And it's the establishing of patterns in language that essentially shape discourses. So in corpus linguistics, the study of language is looked at in terms of recurring, frequent forms in a corpus. A corpus is any collection of texts, such as a collection of news articles on AMR. So the tools will do things like make statistical calculations to tell us what are the most frequent or most prominent terms in a data set, and they will also help us to access that. So this is one of the kind of conventional ways of presenting information using a software tool in corpus linguistics. So each of these lines is a separate occurrence of the term antibiotics, and this just allows us to access lots of data, so we can cast our eye over this and look for patterns of how the term is being used. The tool also allows us to present that visually, so in this mapping of the term, you've got your search term in the middle, antibiotics, and the software tool is telling us what are the most frequent terms that are used around antibiotics. So overuse, prescribed, preventative, unnecessary, and hopefully that is a good example of where that kind of evaluation is coming through. There's ideologies embedded in there in a more critical representation of the issue. We can also tell the software just to tell us what are the most common nouns. So in this process of social actor representation, that helps me access, well, what are the other noun phrases in the reference to antibiotics, or we, for example, can just look at verbs. And again, we can then return to these in context. So this is superbugs in relation to antibiotics, and we can look at the clausal relationship there. So the corpus tool facilitates me as a manual analyzer conducting this clausal level analysis on a large scale. So the data that I was working with was a collection of news articles on AMR over the period beginning in 2010 to the end of 2015. So you can see a kind of gradual increase in the number of articles reported there. And this table shows us what are the most frequently referred nouns in that subject position. So partly dictated by the search criteria, antibiotics is the most consistently reported noun in this data. And you can see that as the coverage increased, as the number of articles increased, we get a broader range of noun phrases in the data, but they are still tending to belong to a rather restricted set of groups. So for example, we've got GPs, doctors, and hospitals there, each referencing a kind of medical professional actor. So what I'm going to do very quickly now is just run through each of those groupings and show what I found to be the most frequent verbal processes associated with those different actors. Starting with antibiotics and looking at the most frequent verbs used there, you've got used, prescribed, working, losing, and becoming. And I think in this first instance, antibiotics are used on farms on livestock under the prescription and care of a veterinary surgeon. I think that's a good example of, again, how certain information is marginalised and other information is prioritised. So the use of the passive voice there, are used, allows the author, the writer, to basically push down the actors to the back end of the sentence. So although you've got veterinary surgeon there, the relationship with the antibiotics, in terms of proximity alone, is quite separate, is distance. You can infer the involvement of farmers, but they're not explicitly labelled there. So again, the use of this passive voice kind of shrouds the actor, if you like. And the same thing happens with prescribed. So some 74% of antibiotics are prescribed by GPs in the UK. The thing about the passive voice is you can actually cut off the end of that when you've got that by GPs, for example. And what the construct prioritizes is, again, the statistical component, the number. But again, we know that decontextualized statistics can be very misleading and very hard to understand, but it just sounds like, a lot. When the data is showing that the verbs working, losing, and becoming are being used in relation to antibiotics, here's where there's almost a sense of agency with the antibiotics themselves. In fact, there is a sense of agency. So this conveys antibiotics as a kind of agentive force that basically is letting us down. There's been a change in events. We used to be able to use these antibiotics. We used to get better. Now that's not happening, and the antibiotics are the active agent in that process. So they're the ones that are failing, as if they are conscious and not working as hard, or whatever the case may be. And we get a similar story with the infections that they are designed to treat. So using the noun phrases, superbugs, bacteria, strains, and infections, these are the verbal processes that we see. So this is a summary of why it's in the news, an ordinary infection that can't be treated by antibiotics. So what was ordinary can no longer be done. There's this change in state of affairs. This is why it's in the news. Disease stops responding to antibiotics. So again, something's changed, something has stopped happening. And again, in these verbs like becoming, develop, adapting, here's where the infections have agency. Bacteria are becoming increasingly resistant to antibiotics. And deadly superbugs evade even the most powerful antibiotics. This is quite common in illness discourse, where illnesses are depicted as kind of malevolent forces that are out to get you, and they will deceive you, or they will hurt you, and they will evade any kind of attempt to treat them. And it's not helped by, you often get visual representations like this, a face on the bacterial strain there, because it's evil. The terms we, you, and patients are the terms that are used most frequently to refer to the general public. So it's interesting to see that they're most often characterized as patients in that kind of medical model. And it's quite a passive role. So the patients are normally treated with antibiotics. That's a passive construction, and in fact, they're often victimized. So many patients could be exposed to antibiotics needlessly. So as patients, if we think of ourselves as patients, we're quite helpless. We're quite passive, and we certainly don't seem to have any agency in that type of construct. Where we do have agency is, we expect antibiotics for uncomplicated infections, and we ask or demand for antibiotics when we've got a cough or a cold. I've had a couple of mentions in previous talks about requests for antibiotics. So again, you've got that scale of how demanding we really are, whether we're asking, requesting, or demanding. But these processes are cognitive and verbal, respectively. So I think it's quite difficult to see where the impact comes in our role in this issue. So what kind of material impact are we having? That process isn't really kind of expanded. And in fact, we talked about how difficult it is to change behaviors. It's really difficult to change cognitive models. So changing expectations is really difficult. So in these constructs, although that's where we're getting the more kind of critical lens pointed at patients, whether that lends itself to then, what do you do? What do you change? We is a fairly flexible term that can be used to create solidarity. This is where the writer is kind of aligning himself with the public. We need to use antibiotics responsibly. That's a fairly agreeable message. We must use far fewer antibiotics, and the modal verbs there create a sense of urgency. But one thing that I'm a little conscious of is when we talk about this kind of collective action or this collectivization, if you haven't already delineated what the respective roles that we all play are, it's very difficult, again, to see how that lends itself to what do we do then? What do we do? What's our role? What are we doing wrong? We're just being told that we need to use antibiotics responsibly. And then you is where you get this most direct address to the audience, to the reader. You might need some antibiotics. And in the more instructive texts, whether you really need antibiotics. So there are attempts in the literature to try and inform people about, maybe in this scenario, but not in this scenario, and that's where you can talk to your GP. It's worth just quickly acknowledging the GP and the medical professionals in this interaction. GPs are increasingly turning to last resort antibiotics, so they're quite desperate. Which again helps to show this as a newsworthy event. But they're also quite reckless, at least according to the news coverage. GPs are dishing out antibiotics, they're doling them out. They're being so liberal with these antibiotics. But again, that relationship between patient and GP is quite complicated and not clearly delineated in these kinds of texts. So many GPs feel under pressure to prescribe antibiotics. So there's not an explicit labeling there of where that pressure is coming from, whether it's from patients, which seems like a reasonable inference, whether it's from the structures in the NHS or other kind of metrics. We're left to our own kind of inferences there. Just the final group I want to talk about is one that's largely omitted, this area of the kind of food supply chain and the farming industry. Despite the frequent use of this statistic, 80% of all antibiotics are used on farm animals. There are very, very, very few mentions of farmers or anyone associated in the food supply chain, at least in that subject position. And when you do get mentions, you get mentions like this. Farmers find themselves using more antibiotics, as if they're kind of aimlessly wandering around and, I've accidentally used antibiotics. And farmers are squeezed by supermarkets and forced to use antibiotics. So there you get a little bit of expansion on this supply chain. You get the kind of pressures implied there. But again, farmers aren't making choices here. They're forced to use. They've got no choice in the matter. So their agency is marginalised. And finally, McDonald's has also pledged to eliminate chickens fed on human antibiotics. So McDonald's there as a food outlet, pledging, again, it's a verbal process. It doesn't really lend itself to action. The eventual action would be to eliminate. And in terms of proximity, there's actually a stronger relationship between chickens and antibiotics. So we're encouraged to think of that association more than we are the farmers or the food suppliers, or even ourselves as food consumers. So that, for me, is a big omission. Where are we in this chain? So, just to quickly summarize, discussions of AMR appear to be oriented around particular social actors. So basically, anyone who I didn't mention there, anyone you could think of who might possibly be mentioned in the issue of AMR, basically wasn't there, because these were the key groups that were discussed. Superbugs and infections are an agentive enemy. How do we beat them? And again, the kind of battle metaphors that you get in health discourse can be helpful for some, but are often quite problematic. Who is responsible? Who can provide a solution? Well, it's GPs that are doling out antibiotics, so they're right there as a kind of demonized set of social actors. Patients are demanding and expecting antibiotics, so maybe we can stop doing that, but how do we get better? This process isn't really followed through. We need to use antibiotics responsibly. I've said that this kind of collectivisation, on the one hand, is good. It kind of says that we're all in it together. We've all got a part to play. But does this really empower or disempower the individual? Because certainly in other contexts, so I've looked at, for example, climate change discourse, it's very easy for people to feel that the issue is too big. It's too big for them. What can I do? I'm just an individual. So it feels like you need to help people understand what they can do. And one of the questions I want to carry forward in my work is, how does the public understand its role in the food supply chain and its contribution to AMR? Because it feels like that's something that, if you make adjustments to diet and food consumption, I would be optimistic about the effects that can have. Thank you.